I'm Mark Lamster. I'm the architecture critic at the Dallas Morning News and a professor at the University of Texas at Arlington School of Architecture. And I will be your moderator here. Our job is to address what we've learned from today and what we've heard from today. So actually, Gail started talking about this incredibly handsome man with beautiful curly brown hair, and kind of thought that was going to be me. I was a little disappointed. So she also mentioned, that obviously one of the things we learned that Boeing's decision to stiff Dallas in the early aughts was engendered great movement here, and she neglected to say, hey, look where Boeing is now. I think the trajectories have been a little bit different. So that being said, I am a critic, which means it is my job to throw a little cold water on the proceedings. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of planning here as relates to some of the things we've heard. And the Kessler Plan, which is extraordinary, and Willis just was showing off an original version of the 1911 plan. But Charles was talking about the Kessler Plan Association and its implementation or lack thereof of the plan. And I just wanted to bring up something that no one talked about, and that's the fact that the Kessler Plan Association was completely racist organization, and not slightly or subtextually, but explicitly racist. So Charles was reading from the Kessler Plan Association in 1927, and I'll also read to you from the Kessler Plan Association in 1927. This is put out by the director of the association in their program to the city. This is the section called The Negro Problem and City Planning. It says, this is a vital part of our city planning progress. Whites who have sought homes are entitled to protection from encroachment of Negroes moving into their neighborhood. This is clear. So I think that's very important to understand that landscape is a political process. It's not just about movement of roads, building of trails, and expansion of the city. It's about people and equity. And the history of landscape in Dallas has not been equitable at all. I've been writing a lot working for the last month or so on a story come out soon about an African-American freedmen's colony in Dallas called Joppy. It's actually spelled Joppa. And it's been the victim of a lot of this planning. As we also heard, some of the African-American communities are set in the places in Dallas that flood. So while Kessler was designing the part of the Kessler plan that was implemented was Turtle Creek, and now a house on Turtle Creek can be worth up to $25 million, whereas the most expensive or the average home price in Joppy is $165,000. So that's the kind of wealth gap that landscape architecture produced. And part of the result of that is the arts district that we're sitting in today that has been presented as some sort of nirvana of landscape and urban design planning, which I do love the arts district, but I think we have to acknowledge its failures, and we also have to acknowledge where it came from. It came out of Fair Park. The institutions, like the one we're standing in, the symphony, etc., we're all in Fair Park. That's where Dallas's arts institutions were located. Those facilities were aging into obsolescence, but the city could have built them back in Fair Park, which is located in an entirely African-American neighborhood. a very poverty-stricken one. But instead, the city decided to tabula rasa build this arts district in an area that is much more convenient to the patronage class, the all-white patronage class, or mostly white patronage class, who have benefited historically from those decisions of landscape and design, as opposed to those who live in areas that have not. I think it's a grand vision of this arts district, but I think another thing that someone mentioned is that Dallas has all of these plans. We keep building these plans. I forget who was, maybe it was Phil, who said he didn't need to see any more plans anymore in Dallas. We have a record of making plans. Some of them are great, but we continue to make plans after plan after plan. It's almost like a Dallas. Dallas does more plan making than any other city, and I think it's a way of not actually doing anything. If you make a plan, then you kind of debate about it for 5 more years. Then by the time that period's up, then the plan's obsolete, so you got to go back to do another plan, and it goes on ad infinitum until nothing gets done. It's sort of like a tradition here that I see having happened. So I think that's part of the reality of Dallas, and it's sort of what's exciting now is that we're a moment where things are actually starting to happen here, and we've had some incredible momentum. I don't know where. I guess we can choose. You can choose to start at Pioneer Park. You can choose to start at the Arts District as the impetus. You can choose Clyde Warren Park as the impetus. But I don't think there's any doubt that things are actually changing here. So I don't want to be completely pessimistic because I'm incredibly optimistic about Dallas. And I'm really glad that you're all here to discover this place that I really love and have come to love. It's an incredible moment. We've heard about these 4 extraordinary parks that are happening in downtown. We've heard about the Trinity Park. We'll talk today a little bit about Fair Park and bringing it back to life. I don't think there's any city in America that can be so transformed by parks as Dallas has the potential to be. But also, our big problem isn't necessarily parks, but the connectivity between the parks, which we've also heard about, which is that we have a city that's largely concrete and asphalt, and most of our trees, even when we have them, are restricted to the Trinity. So that's an issue that we have to tackle here. And I think the people in this room are trying to do as best they can. We've got bond packages that are trying to promote that kind of thinking. And I think there is a new kind of thinking here. But I've noticed a lot of really I think landscape architecture tends to be very optimistic profession, and also very I think there's a sense of righteousness, and I would just be careful with that, because that's where Kessler. Look what our city did. It's divided. We've always thought we've been doing the righteous thing, and somehow we ended up where we are. So I think it's important to always question yourself and your motives and your assumptions. And I say that because I'm a critic, and that's how I get paid. So this city is rising. It's changing. Gail mentioned that the Pegasus as our civic symbol. I think for me, the best mythical creature symbolizing Dallas is something called the woofus. And if you go out to Fair Park, you can see this. The woofus is a mythical creature that is a combination of all the animals that are brought on display at the Fair Park. So it's part horse, part longhorn, part pig, part turkey, part sheep. Probably a couple other things. I'm New York City born. I don't know anything about animals. To me, that's the great symbol of Dallas. It's this. It's who we are. We're like this crazy thing that's all come together, and we're trying to just figure it all out. And I find that's the city in a nutshell. It's a little crazy. It's fun to be here. I hope you're enjoying your time. Living in Dallas is like going to the circus every day of the year. And with that, so to me, that this is what my takeaway is, that from what we learned today is be serious about paying attention to history, but also understand both the positives and the negatives that come with it. With that, I've taken up my time, and I can now introduce the first speaker of our panel, Dustin Bullard, with all the positive things we do here to try and make Dustin, you can just promote yourself. They're the fabulous downtown nonprofit that supports all the positive things we do here to try and make downtown a more livable and amenable place.
So yeah, Downtown Dallas Inc. was mentioned several times today. So we are a nonprofit. Most of our funding comes from a public improvement district. So we are here to make downtown better, from operations to long-range planning. So I'm a senior vice president there. I oversee everything but public safety for the organization. So I work with a lot of private developers. I am a landscape architect. I came from the private side. I never thought that I would be doing what I'm doing today, which is not only working with amazing landscape architects and planners throughout this country to make positive change in downtown, but also working with developers who are doing millions of square feet of new development in downtown. So it's really unique. But I'm also humbled because I also still have to pick up the trash in the parks and power wash and deal with the dog shit and everything else that comes along with urban spaces. So it's very multifaceted, but we're really excited at the moment in time. We're here today. What I really took away today, I've been in Dallas only about 15 years. I've lived downtown for 15 years. So I don't have the history that so many folks today have had with this community. Didn't grow up here. But I think what we've seen is this city has had no lack of vision. Really from its founding, and I think that vision has been an amazing piece that's driven this city forward, and is something that as we continue to progress, we can't forget. I do think when we look back historically, there have been some really bad plans and some really bad ideas that have been advanced through the city, and so I challenge each of you, don't be the person that's cussed out in 20 years for a really terrible plan, and I think what happens is when we do this in a vacuum, so we think we have a really good idea, but we don't listen to the community. And what I heard today and what I think is inspiring of all the work we saw within this public space, not just parks, but also the great work Jeanette's doing in public rights of ways, which I think are neglected spaces historically in all major cities, is that community piece, and how do we begin to heal and stitch back together forgotten areas or areas of the city that were neglected. And I think we saw today some really bold moves that can begin to do that. And we can begin to come together as a collective citizenry in these public spaces. And so it's not always about a gathering space like Clyde Warren, which is that safe space. And I think Dallas saw that ability to be a community that came out and everybody's the same, but everybody's very different. And I think that was something that was lacking within this city in a very deliberate way. And so we saw that ability. And so now how do we begin to not replicate that experience, but replicate that notion in all areas of our city? And so I do think that those public spaces, things like trails and sidewalks, while maybe not as fun as some of the other projects that we talked about and maybe not as active, are probably much more important from a city building perspective. So as landscape architects, I really challenge the profession to look at that and to be very deliberate in the manner in which we do that, and how those spaces really do shape all generations in this city, because we're making a mark on a city that will last well beyond our years, and we can't forget that.
Thank you, Dustin. And our next guest, Valletta, Forsyte, Lille, former city council person, currently the director of the Dallas Historical Society, which is the principal occupant, really, year-round at least, of Fair Park, a advocate of preservation, and basically a winner of every civic award that we have. So it's a pleasure to be with her here, always, Valletta.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for being here today. Interestingly enough, I feel I'm bookmarked by the legends, actually, and I am, like many people, fairly new to this city. My husband and I moved here in 1985, largely because it was warmer than Chicago and it was centrally located. There was not a great deal of vision to this, although my husband had been hired as a pilot for American Airlines, so that truly was the reason we moved here, but he could have chosen other cities and we chose this one. Because we felt, as I said, it was warm and centrally located, but it also had a certain amount of optimism, and it was 1985 and things were still good, Robert. 2 years later, the car was stolen from in front of our house, and, we learned a lot about living here through a recession. But I am not a professional urban planner. I'm not a landscape architect. My stepfather told me when I was 17 years old and headed for the University of Illinois, you know what you should major in? Urban planning. And I was like, what? What is that about? And I didn't do that. And I have discovered in my life that was my passion. And it probably was the thing I should have listened to my parents about, and I didn't. But I ended up here, and the role I have played largely has been as policymaker. And I feel policymakers, and I would like to see more of them in my audience today, are so pivotal to how cities look and thrive. And you heard earlier today about how our civic leaders, and certainly people like Eric Johnson and other mayors, played a role in creating the plans, and how our Fourth Estate played an extremely important role in promoting those plans. But it is extremely important that policymakers not sit to the sidelines, that they be a part of how we develop. I was fascinated, as Charles talked in the beginning. He kept repeating the term chaos, which was a little unnerving when I thought about it. But I think that we came out of that, as you pointed out, and became much more focused about where we were going. But we also have a tendency to do some of the shiny things and go to the next plan. And as you pointed out, some of those were great plans, whether Kessler with its flaws, but Bartholomew, not so good. And equity was lost, and arrogance and efficiency sort of played a role. And then we came out of that. I was actually a Dallas City Council member when Boeing spurned us. And the choice, interestingly enough, was made when Boeing came to town. And I think it was more than us not having a perfect downtown, because we did not. But we made the choice to woo that company by literally going to a hotel in the suburbs, of which I can't remember, it's a golf course, and it's a Four Seasons, the Four Seasons, to kind of tell them how great we were. Meanwhile, I knew the people that I knew in Chicago were taking, dining and drinking cocktails in the Shed Aquarium. It was a very different vision of what an American city looked like. If you go to Irving to the Four Seasons, it would look just like the Four Seasons in any suburban city in America. So I think we made more than wrong choices about some of what was going on downtown. We made a wrong choice in the way we promoted ourselves. we did not promote ourselves with some of the things that we were doing. I think another thing that I heard today, maintenance kept coming up, both from where we are today and the downtown parks, which Robert will talk about what he's doing. But it's really true that Dallas, and Mark mentioned it as well, we build, we exalt, we move on. And we do not always maintain, and we do not always continue to work on those plans and massage the great plans and continue to work through that. So I always tell, D Magazine has got a new article out about, we're 10 years into the AT&T Performing Arts Center. And Peter Simic wrote the article, and I said to him two things. One, every good neighborhood needs 50 years. I still have 9 more years on this neighborhood. And Dallas has had a tendency to open some of its grandest facilities in its worst economic times. So we opened Fair Park in the height of the Depression. We opened this building, fortunately in '84, but by '89 when we opened the Symphony Hall, we're in the depths of the banking crash. We opened the AT&T Performing Arts Center in 2009, and literally a New York Times reporter said to me, it's terrible economic times. You sure you want to do this? And I'm like, was there a choice at this point that we just put hundreds of millions of dollars into this? But the choice sometimes we make after it when we open these beautiful spaces in that time is not to maintain them and not to continue with the plan. And I think those are the things that we need. I challenge people who live here and policymakers to do is to stay with it. You make a plan, you feel it's a good plan, stay with it, develop that, and continue to work with that plan. And as my good friend Philip Henderson said, I don't need another plan. But stay with it and maintain that which you do build, because that is what that's what makes people enjoy the space or the building.
Thank you. Our next speaker is, well, first of all, he's responsible for me coming to Dallas as the former publisher and current CEO of parent company of the Dallas Morning News. So if you're unhappy with the moderation, it's his fault. But Robert Tegger's also been, I guess, the founder and certainly the instrumental force behind Parks for Downtown Dallas, and these 4 new parks coming to downtown Dallas now, in addition to several previous parks, a truly extraordinary gift to the city. God, you're fantastic. Got to butter up the boss, sorry.
Why, thanks, Mark. and Charles, thanks to you for creating this gathering. It's an important opportunity for our city. And while Gail points out rightly that we should be talking to our policymakers in Valletta's context and our fellow civically engaged citizens, having you here is a wonderful chance for us to talk about some of the things we are accomplishing. There's a lot of work to be done, things that have been done, but also to have your insight into how we are going at this. We certainly don't have all the answers, and Mark's made a couple of important points about the vagaries of planning that we should all take to heart. I certainly am not in a position to comment on the Kessler plan itself, but going back that far, my great-grandfather, who established the Dallas Morning News in 1985, was one of the leading citizens of the city. The city then, as Charles talked about this morning, was really just a commercial concentration where a bunch of rail lines crossed, and that was how the city was established in a terribly oversimplified way. But at the same time, because of the ways the city established itself, there was a civic alchemy created then that persists even to today. That's a long and complex sidebar. It brought with it a number of contradictions along the way. Speaking of the Kessler Plan, which had all of the, I'll say, very positive planning elements that we've talked about today, there was this other side, but using G.B. Dealey as an example, who was very focused on the development of the city and did a number of important things like put the first trash can in a public space outside. That's actually true. You know, this was a pretty rough and tumble place, and the city was concentrated geographically, physically in the center, and so the Kessler Plan extending beyond that had a higher purpose. The contradictions that Mark cited, you have to then look at this civic alchemy or take it into account. G.B. Dealey was not the sponsor of the Dallas plan, the Kessler Plan, but he certainly was an advocate for it. In fact, he was quite close to George Kessler personally because he admired his professional capabilities. G.B. Dealey was also the person who took on and destroyed the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s and did it at the risk of our company failing. So, you know, you can pick parts of all this out, and I'm not quibbling with Mark. I'm just trying to encourage as we think about our current opportunities in your cities, in our cities. It's about all of the societal dimensions that have been cited today, as well as the wonders of what can be produced in architecture and landscape architecture as a result of this alchemy. And while we can, again, go back and forth on the Arts District, being the most chronologically advanced person on this panel, I will acknowledge to you that I was actually there, and I was the president of the Dallas Symphony Association at age 28, and our task was A, to keep it out of bankruptcy, and B, acquire the land for the Meyerson Symphony Hall, which we did, and the rest is, as we say, history. I do know something about that, and I just want to make a comment to amplify on what Mark said and really underscore the point Valletta just made. In my cryptic notes here, one of the last things I was going to say is a park that's neglected or deteriorates, becomes a liability. And I promise you, in 1975, Fair Park was a liability. All 277 acres of it. It was a tragic result of what should have been a very different story. And so when the civic leaders, maybe overly possessed of this alchemy I'm talking about, looked at the choices for downtown, this was more about downtown and the center of the city than it was a judgment about Fair Park. The consensus was, we have lost the energy of our center city, and there is a dramatic and accelerating flight to the suburbs that will get out of hand, and it did. So when these choices were made and the concept of the Arts District was created, that was as much a motivating factor as it was, let's get out of these ancient and also neglected facilities at Fair Park and cater to the patrons of the symphony and the art district. That is just not accurate. I was here, I think I know. But it was perceived that way. And it's a very fair perception in a city that has had more than its share of contradictions among the people who comprise our city. Racial, ethnic, gender, all of that. And yet today, every one of those important participants in the life of our city, I would submit, are in a better place than they were 25 or 30 years ago, or have the potential soon to be if we do this right. Therefore, the work that we've done on parks is an extension of the thinking that goes back literally 45 years about what a center city has to be in order for a metropolitan area the size of Dallas-Fort Worth to thrive and to be a place that is not only accessible to, but meaningful in the lives of people from all backgrounds, all economic status, all degrees of aspiration. You do that in your cities. This is not unique to Dallas. I always catch myself when people ask me about the work of Parks for Downtown Dallas. What we're doing is occurring in different ways in every city in America. The move back to center cities is prevalent across the U.S. We think we're doing it in a smart way. We think we're using resources intelligently. And I just want to speak to some of those points as we go along. The punchline, though, is in a downtown that was, because of its origins, a very concentrated commercial district, which in its original form had not a single park in the center of Dallas. From 2004, when Mary Margaret Jones and Ken and their colleagues at Hargraves Jones finished the first downtown parks master plan, and concluding in just 3 years, at the end of 2022, this city, not just our group, this city with private partners will have built 23 acres of new parks inside the freeway loop. That doesn't happen by happen chance. So again, just referring to this civic approach, the public-private partnership approach that has been referenced all day, that is critical, it's pivotal to that kind of outcome, and it will also influence every one of the projects you heard about today that are more prospective, and they're very ambitious and very expensive. I can't resist just mentioning plans. Sign me up for There Are Too Many Plans. I know many of you create plans as a livelihood, but without a discipline, a policy framework, as Valletta said, you can do exactly what Mark described. You produce plan after plan after plan, and ironically, after the Boeing adios, I was asked by the then mayor, who had been beating up on me personally in our company for about 10 years, she called me and she said, "Hi." I said, "Hi, how are you doing?" She said, "Great, I need your help." I said, "Okay." And her request, which turned out, I think, to be incredibly beneficial for downtown, was, look, there are all these plans out there. I'm making you the chairman of a group that's going to exist for one purpose only, and that is to get all these plans, put them together in a single, simplified, understandable, actionable form, and then go away. And we did. And out of that have come very sophisticated, very detailed plan. Dustin's organization has been central to that. The Parks Master Plan came out of that exercise. It was a direct byproduct because Willis and his predecessor, Paul Dyer, when we asked, well, where's the master plan for downtown parks, the answer was, well, we don't have one, and we never had one. So just think about that. Less than 20 years, we've gone from a standing start to where we have arrived today, and we have much more work to do. Just a few comments. As you think about how all of this works, and by works I mean you take from concept to plan to implementation, what we're experiencing in Dallas right now is very interesting from an urban planning and dynamism. Capital follows capital. So when the public or private sector invest capital, the other party tends to follow if it's invested wisely. And when it's not, you and I both know it's a complete non-starter. An enormous amount of capital has been invested in the center of this city in the last 25 years for a variety of reasons. And more recently, it has become so intense, this capital formation, that another very predictable phenomenon is taking root, which I think may be one of the single most important things for our city for the next half century. Capital protects capital. Once the private sector, whether it's a pension fund, a partnership, whomever, when they invest capital in a project with or without public sector capital, they're going to protect the capital. billions of dollars have been invested within 2 miles of where you're sitting over the last 25 years. The people who invested it are going to protect it. So that gives Dallas and all of us who are involved in these ambitious projects an ability to rely on a tax base and tax revenues that are the envy of most cities in America. That's not a pitch, it's a fact. And if you look at other cities where you don't have that same kind of optimism or concerns about the downside, it's because we have managed our balance sheet very intelligently in this city. You say what you will about whether our tax rate is too low, whether we spend enough money on various forms of public services, but the fact is the City of Dallas balance sheet is in very good condition, and with all of this private sector capital coming in, you can see things like Clyde Warren create a huge influx of value for our tax base. And the 4 parks we're building at Parks for Downtown Dallas will do the same thing. Last point I'd make, and then I'll take a pause here. The importance of public-private partnerships has been noted several times today. The approach we've taken, and I would submit it's worth considering in some of your projects, if you can match up with a partner who is singly focused on one set of objectives and has the capital to back it up, a lot of very good things will happen. The foundation that comprises Parks for Downtown Dallas actually was created by the Dallas Morning News in 1954. And in 2015, we decided we needed to be focused, we needed to get associated with something of very high potential. And so this is a single purpose foundation. We don't get distracted easily. It's about one thing. It's about building the 4 priority parks that were identified in the second or updated version of the Downtown Parks Master Plan. That ability to be focused, to work through all the public policy and bureaucratic and political aspects of this is a tremendously important advantage. I could go on a long time about that. Amy Meadows, who moderated this morning's panel, she and the 4 landscape firms who are doing this work, this is all we do. We describe it as Switzerland. We're Switzerland. We don't get outside the borders. We're neutral. We only have one purpose. And I think if you've had a chance to see Pacific Plaza and the parks you're going to tour tomorrow, it's a pretty great result. Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker, our final speaker, appropriately enough, really needs no introduction. Willis Winters, director of our Park and Recreation Department, who is retiring now in 2 weeks. I don't know what we're going to do without you, Willis. Willis has been responsible for just the immense growth of parks in Dallas under his direction. We got the most famous, new city park in America in Clyde Warren Park, but that only is like the tip of the iceberg of his tenure, expanding access to parks really across the city at the same time as being one of the most active civic bastions of preservation and positive progressive thinking about design. So with that, I give you Willis Winters.
Thank you, Mark. So first, I'd like to give you a little history about the park department, since we're kind of into history today, which I love, and I want to thank Charles for his great presentation on the early city planning efforts in Dallas, which were done by the Park Board, which was formed in 1905. So by the City Council, which was the year after a catastrophic failure at Fair Park at the State Fairgrounds. Fair Park back from 1886 to 1903 or 4 was owned by the State Fair, had a fire. State legislature outlawed parimutuel betting, so they lost their 2 principal revenue sources for their buildings and horse track. They deeded the land of Fair Park to the City of Dallas in 1903, and the city agreed to have a bond referendum, one of the early referendums for parks in Dallas, to come up with money and funding to build a new exhibition hall for the State Fair. So in 1904, believe it or not, Fair Park became Dallas's second city park. The first one was Old City Park from 1876. We didn't get our second city park until 28 years later because of this fire at the fair. The city council, the Dallas City Council, quickly found out that they did not like all of the issues and contracts and stuff coming to their agenda dealing specifically with Fair Park. So they formed the Park Board in 1905 to take all of that stuff off their agenda to give it to the Park Board to deal with. The interesting thing is it was an administrative board, not an advisory board, as almost every park department in the country is not governed. It's under an advisory board and then reports up to usually a city manager. There's self-funded park districts that do have an administrative board, but we're one of the very few municipalities in the country that has an administrative board, and that's who I actually work for. I work for the park board, not for the Dallas city manager. Big difference in how our department, I think, has been, why it's been so successful over the years. I'm the seventh director since 1905. You can do the math on that. That's not very many people, and my tenure has ended up not being as long as some of them. I think the first one was like 45 years. L.B. Houston was 35 years. My predecessor was 22 years. So I'm calling it a day at 6.5, and that will be de-stressing after a couple of weeks. But I've worked with the department for 27 years. I'm an architect. Brent Brown also proclaimed him being an architect, and I'm one of the few architects in the country that's also a director of a park department, and so that brings a different perspective. Certainly, I'm been obviously focused on the capital side of the department, the capital program, designing and building things. God knows I've probably done 80% of the master plans that Mark says we've got too many of in Dallas, and we've remaster planned the master plans, and I've been here long enough. We're probably in 3.0 on some of our parks. White Rock Lake, Fair Park had a great master plan done by Hargraves in 2004, 2003. We're now just here 16 years later getting around to updating that master plan. I think there's still a lot of validity in it, but prior to that, we saw Charles showed some master plans for Fair Park that went back to Hare and Hare in the 1940s, and of course George Kessler did the first Fair Park master plan in 1904 prior to that being deeded over to the city. So bond programs, I think I'm in my 7th bond program. I've got an incredible staff of architects, engineers, and landscape architects. It's like having your own architecture firm, design firm in-house. Louise Elam is here today, assistant director that leads that group, and I would not be where I am without her being at my side for the last 15 to 20 years. And the only difference is that with this, as an architect, I don't have to worry where the fees come from or where the money comes from. We just spend money. So over the last, since I've been here, 27 years, we've probably, the city in bond programs with matched funding from the private sector has probably seen the investment of almost $1 billion in the Dallas park system. That's a lot for a city of our size. I always compare us and benchmark us with other cities, and I think we've done really well. The projects that we've seen today alone, the 10 projects, Loop Trail, the Medical District, the 4 downtown parks, Clyde Warren Park, the Sculpture Center, and Harold Simmons Park. I think that's almost another $1 billion worth of projects in both the public sector and the private sector. Some of the weird things that happen when you have an architect as a park director is start, looking. I'm not always looking for pushing boundaries, looking for different ways to approach things that have been done the same way for forever. Back in the 90s, I started to question the practice of, or maybe let me rephrase that. I started to look for an opportunity of how we could bring great architecture into the neighborhoods of Dallas. We had great architecture, big projects downtown in the Arts District with our cultural facilities, but I began to see an opportunity for doing something as simple as a park pavilion, a picnic shelter. What could we do to enhance that capital investment in our city's infrastructure? And so we began to hire architects, some of whom are in this room, and landscape architects to custom design our pavilions. As an example, I picked up the phone one day and called a firm in Norway called Snøhetta, which was an emerging firm at the time. Actually, they had just opened a Dallas office, but their partner, one of their partners, was born and raised in Dallas, and asked them if they would design me a picnic shelter. And they said, well, sure, why not? Same thing with some of our other consultants on projects. So today we've got about 35 custom designed pavilions. Barbara Wilkes is here from New York City. She did one for us at Lakewood Park probably 15 years ago. And we have about 35 custom designed pavilions now around the city, showing us that it's not the big projects that matter, it's the small things that also make a difference, and putting those projects in throughout Dallas's neighborhoods. So master plans, we've done economic impact studies of the park system. Several folks have quoted some figures from that master plan: a 7-to-1 return on investment from capital investment in parks. So for every dollar spent on a bond project, whether that's a playground or a stadium, there's a 7-to-1 return through property tax increase in real estate value, and direct spending. The Katy Trail in our economic impact study came back as a 50-to-1 return, and you can see everyone here knows what's happened with that. Some of the characteristics of our department over the years is that we're big on partnerships. I've got many of them are in this room. We've heard from many today at Parks for Downtown Dallas. Robert and Amy, thank you for everything you've done. We've heard from Jeanette Manier at Texas Trees Foundation. We've not only had a peripheral involvement with the Southwestern Medical District, but the bigger project that's had an incredible impact on Dallas is this we've worked with them to address the 10-minute walk initiative. We've had 2 mayors that have signed on as big supporters for that over the years, early in the program with the Trust for Public Land, and that means basically that everyone in our city should live, the goal is everyone should live within 10 minutes or a half-mile walk of a park, green space, or trail. Dallas's percentage is 60%. That means that 561,000 people, when we started doing the metrics and data analysis, 561,000 people did not live within 10-minute walk of a public park. In a city like Dallas, where we have no land dedication ordinance and no funding to buy land, and even if we did, there was no land to buy in most areas of the city, especially in neighborhoods in North Dallas that developed rapidly during the 60s and 70s, and there was no requirement for developers and subdivision builders to dedicate parkland in the center of their neighborhoods. There's no land to buy even if we had the funding. So we crafted a partnership with the Dallas Independent School District and later Richardson Independent School District, Texas Trees Foundation, the Trust for Public Land, whereby we identified 25 neighborhood school sites in DISD, 6 sites in RI at Richardson ISD, and negotiated an interlocal agreement whereby those school campuses, the playgrounds on those campuses would serve the school purposes by day, and then at night, after school and on weekends, they would become a public park for the first time. People that lived around those schools were not allowed access until this ILA was executed. Suddenly they had access. And so our park coverage jumped with that one action alone with those 31 schools, jumped from 60% to 69% overnight. And this is also related to something called the TPL, Trust for Public Land Park Score, which scores cities on things like connectivity and park coverage. And now we're doing we've done another agreement, again, working with the Texas Trees Foundation and TPL with a very generous philanthropic grant now to go back and build the playgrounds on these sites, but also to add another, I think, 28 park sites, which will take our coverage from 69% to 78%. So in 4 years, Dallas will have gone from 60% coverage to 78% coverage that live within a 10-minute walk, and therefore will be the city in Texas with the highest percent. I want to close also by again thanking Boeing for the crucial decision they made many years ago to go to another city, or I don't believe we would be here today.
Valletta, you're in Fair Park, I think most days in your role with the Dallas Historical Society. I'm not sure how familiar with actually being in Fair Park the audience here is. So maybe you could talk to the audience a little bit about the challenges the park faces and also about where things are now with the new administration of Fair Park First, et cetera.
Thanks, Mark. I hope that those of you from out of town will come back probably in November because you won't be able to get in the park right now because it's state fair time, but I urge folks to come and see the park. It's fine if you go to the fair, but also see it otherwise. Recently, probably in the last, 4 years ago, I did go on the board of the Dallas Historical Society, and then last year I went on the board of Fair Park First, which is the public-private partnership that took over Fair Park. And I did that largely because 2 things. I love history, and secondly, I was really tired of Fair Park getting the short end of the stick. And I thought this will be my last big project. And it may kill me, but I will be there. Fair Park, as Willis gave you a little idea of what it was like before the 1936 centennial. And then in 36, in our worst economic times, we built a great exposition celebrating the centennial of the state of Texas. And we built some of the most magnificent buildings, and one of those is the home of the Historical Society, which is the Hall of State, and it is top 4 most important buildings in the state of Texas. So if you have a chance, and we are also in the National Landmark. Fair Park is a challenge for a lot of reasons. Number 1, it is big. It's 277 acres. As Mark talked earlier about, racism has overlaid some of the issues. It is located in a very low income neighborhood. In fact, if you look at the numbers, among the lowest income neighborhoods in Dallas surround that park. They have been marginalized and indeed kept out of the park and kept out of decisions over time. So that has played a major role in decision making as we are going forward. We talked a lot about equity today, and what we're trying to do now is to deal with that in an equitable way. It is the home to the state fair, and has been for over 100 years. And as a result, that what is a pastoral setting in most days is wildly crowded for the 3 weeks of the fair, but not just 3 weeks of the fair. They have a temporal footprint there from August 1 to almost the end of October. So basically 3 months out of the year. And that is the setting up of everything from car shows to one thing that truly bothers me is they come in and set up chain link fence between the African American Museum and the Dallas Summer Musicals on August 1 in the parking lot. That's never a welcoming sign when you see chain link fence. So the state fair is extremely important to Dallas, and you saw earlier today it being quoted as important in the economic health of our city. At the same time, it is an elephant at the dinner table when you are trying to redevelop a space or when you are trying to activate a space. Then Mark alluded to the departure of many of our artistic institutions for a variety of reasons. And I would agree with you, Robert. Some of those we were trying to redevelop downtown and because downtown was dying. But I see a pivotal point really, and I don't want to blame them, but when the Pro left, that was kind of the last sucking sound out of Fair Park. To that point, we had put some different institutions in. So in the 2003 plan, the recommendation was you need to put this large park under a single umbrella organization, which we have done in the form of Spectra Fair Park First, so that somebody is the daddy and you don't have multiple people who have oversight. And I think it was probably Willis's happiest day, the day we said we would take over Fair Park. And
We had to go through the process twice, so it took a little extra time, but I think we do have the right team in place with our 501c3 partner, Fair Park First. They have 2 critical team members, a national venue management firm, Spectra, that actually operates and maintains the park day to day with amazing experience, and then a planning partner from New York, Dan Biederman, who is famous for the rejuvenation of Bryant Park. Dan's role, his firm's role, is to update the master plan and to oversee the design of one or more neighborhood parks within the current Fair Park boundaries.
And then from there, we are working to secure tenants for the buildings that have been vacated. And they need to be the right tenants. They need to be groups that have plans, have means of raising money, are destination rather than one-offs someplace else. And those need to happen. And going back to the planning that Willis recommended, or that is part of the comprehensive plan, it is extremely important that the thing we need most is putting the park back in the park. It needs to be greener. And as Charles mentioned this morning, there has not been enough reverence to hair and hair working there or to the landscape of Fair Park, which we will now have to deal with, as well as the buildings, the landscape, and the inequity.
I plead guilty to not paying enough attention to hair and hair. I think that's something I'm going to rectify. I think part of the problem is that the preservation issues on the architectural of the park are so incredibly pressing, and then the political issues surrounding the park are also so central to any discussion. This is the reason that sort of the landscape architecture, which is the ground on which this all depends, sort of ends up being walked over to make many metaphorical infelicities. I guess the most important question I can ask you to think here is that, I mean, we've heard today about these really amazing progress the city has made in terms of park building. Clyde Warren, the four new parks from parks for downtown Dallas, Fair Park becoming rejuvenated, and of course the incredible Trinity Park, which has the potential to shift the entire polarity of the city. But in a way, these are all sort of destination objects in themselves. And the real essential problem in Dallas, if we've solved providing parks in some way, it's the connectivity between them. The city is still not green at all. It's still, so predominantly car-oriented, asphalt-oriented, and just a pedestrian disaster. Even the Arts District here, I would argue, which was created to be a pedestrian-driven thoroughfare, isn't. If you walk through it, you'll notice these incredibly high-traffic thoroughfares, Pearl and Olive, going through it. It's worth your life to try and cross them. It's sort of, there's not fully, the tree cover only goes halfway the distance on Flora, and even the facilities have started moving away from the street line. Even the Meyerson, the grand entry to the Meyerson is really from the garage. So I think the city's attention to walkability has always been more lip service than reality. Or maybe that's unfair, but, well, it actually isn't. There have been attempts to improve periodically, let's say. But so I guess my question to the panel, and any one of you can take this, and maybe all of you should take this, is what do we do to improve that? How do we get from one of these places to another so that they aren't just isolated islands, but that we can improve the character of the entire landscape of the city and not just parks?
So I think it's a really important point, and I think two things. One, I will speak more myopically to the downtown area, but I think one of the things that we've seen in Dallas as we've begun redeveloping not only our public spaces but also private spaces is we had very terrible connections between them. So we saw great growth in the uptown area. We began to see great growth in downtown, Deep Ellum, the Cedars, all these great surrounding neighborhoods. But what we learned is we could only get to them with our vehicle. We had no other option. It wasn't that people wouldn't walk. We didn't give them that option because for so long, and again, I've only been here for not that many years, but I would always hear people say, nobody's going to walk, it's hot in Dallas. Or people don't get out of their house, or people aren't going to get out of their car. And so I think that what we've seen in the last probably 20 to 30 years in the marketplace is a pivot and a change in that direction. And so what I think the driver here is twofold in my opinion. One, I think when we create these public spaces and we get people out of office buildings and out of their apartments and out of their homes and interacting in the public, then the public, our citizenry, begins to say, well, why can't I walk from Clyde Warren Park to the farmer's market without getting hit by a truck or the sidewalk ending? And so I don't think we had that public outcry until we invited people out into the public space. And I think that directly becomes a policy decision. And so I think my hope is that as we begin to turn these spaces on and invite people into the city and into these grand public spaces, we then make a deliberate policy decision and a public investment strategy around that. Because when we really look, and this is one thing we focus on at our organization and a lot of the work that we do, when we look at public lands, the majority of the land holdings within our city are tied up within roadway networks. And so if we want to make impactful change, we should be focusing on those public lands. And so often we use that as just a one mode utility option. And I think what we're seeing is new ideas to look at that. So I think it's very important, Mark, and I hope that we get it right, but I don't think we've had a great history in that.
I'm going to go back to policy. And I really want us to make sure we are talking policy, right? Because they make, I'm sorry, good decisions. So, not us getting to the point. I just saw we're putting in sidewalks wherever there were state highways that have been converted. They are making them behind, they're right next to the curb. And they've done it at Samuel Graham Park. When I could walk to Samuel Graham Park, I can't walk long at 45 miles an hour. And that was a policy decision, not by the Parks Department, but by people putting money into that. Talk to your elected officials about why planning, landscape architecture, and architecture are important, and ensure it's in planning.
Two aspects to that. I think Dustin was talking about the tactical level of getting people through and around downtown. I guess our role in that, the parks role, is as we're building these urban parks, saw a really good example of where we can enhance the streetscape experience, especially like in making connections, as Chuck said, between the farmers market and the arts district along Harwood Street. We have not one, but not two, but three parks along Harwood Street. It's a great opportunity for us to enhance those kind of tactical connections. And then, of course, the other example from a more strategic level is the citywide trail network, and Philip Henderson gave you a great presentation today on this idea of, we have 158 miles of trails in place, but we don't have some really important critical connections between those trails. And so the Loop Trail project does that by putting in those 4 red lines that he showed you today, and that's just phase 1. That'll create a 50-mile loop to address connectivity. And then beyond that, I can't wait till we can tackle the next outer loop for an even longer and broader connectivity, on the scale of the Beltline Trail in Atlanta.
Mark and the panel, thank you very much. We've done this closing panel a number of times, and you never know where it's going to take you. And today was no different, and it was an interesting ride. I want to conclude with 2 things. First, some thank yous, and then some remarks in relation to this last conversation. First of all, I want to thank our speakers, not just for being speakers, but being so generous with their intellectual capital, and in particular, Valletta and Gail. I couldn't have come here and parachuted in the way that we have unless I had Sherpers who gave us the Monarch Notes versions of not only who were the right speakers for the topics that we were looking at, but who were the right speakers to engage our audience today. So to all of our speakers for both their presentations and their mentorship, I thank you all. As someone who wasn't here on stage with us today, just because we can only squeeze so many people in, as we saw, this has been a bit of a, I don't know if anyone else has, I've burned 485 calories just holding up the sign that says 3 minutes. But Terry Arterburn, I'm not sure where you are, Terry, but Terry has been our person on the ground. He's on the Stewardship Council of the Foundation, And the hoop jumping and support all along the way from Terry was key and critical. I also want to thank the Texas chapter of the ASLA. They have had volunteers, they have been promoting this, they have been our local support team, and so to everyone with the chapter, I want to thank you all for all of your efforts, and hold your applause. I also want to thank DAF, the Dallas Institute, and ADEX also for the amount of outreach that they have all done. I'm not going to mention the names of all of the sponsors. I don't know if I can. Oh, there they are. So there isn't enough time, but in particular, I also want to thank Chuck McDaniel, who went the distance in helping me to make introductions so that this whole program could be possible, beginning last night at the Nasher, which was a wonderful way to start the conversation and a wonderful way to inaugurate the topic of why stewardship and maintenance matter in terms of maintaining design intent and to inspire us to see what the highest standard looks like. I want to thank Catherine Rose for helping to connect us here with the museum to making today possible. And then I'm sure hiding in the back of the room somewhere, the person that loves to deflect, so we might have to applaud loudly because she's out in the hallway, but Suzanne Garza, who has managed everything today. I want to conclude by responding just a little bit to the idea of disjointed objects, which was a criticism of the projects that we just saw today. And Mark was being provocative, and I'll be provocative in response. If we were writing about building architecture and we wrote about a building, we wouldn't apply such a criticism most of the times. There are some critics that might, but generally speaking, we will allow building architecture to exist as an object. We'll write about, Ada Louise will write about the Pennzoil building in Houston, and that's how we wrote about building architecture, and we've written about places here as well. But I think it does us a disservice when we diminish what I think is an outsider that comes here to see what is happening. Because what is happening here right now, in my opinion, is truly remarkable. And I know we have 11 students here from the UT Austin program, and I met some of them earlier when the day started. Today is about standing on the shoulders of others and the kind of mentorship and what we learn from each other. And as I listened to this closing panel, I just had a few thoughts that were not something that I really put a bow on, if you will, this morning. The first thing that I started thinking about is that if we think about the origins of planning in Dallas, between the 10s and about 1950, it was planning in a vacuum. We didn't care what the public thought. And perhaps if you lived on the high ground and you had the social connections, you had the ability to affect that process. And if you lived in the lowlands, if you were in the floodplain of the Trinity, well then, good luck. That was the message. And then we had a period that started in the 80s. And as landscape architects, and we heard, even though Pete Walker wasn't in the room, he was very present. We heard from Pete about the influence of Dan Kiley, and we saw that the work of Kiley and Kiley Walker, and then Pete Walker, and how it elevated the artistry of landscape architect. And it showed us here in Dallas, but also elsewhere, what landscape architects are capable of doing when they want to elevate landscape architecture as an art form. And then last night at the Nasher, we inaugurated the first international landscape architecture prize named for Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, who embodies the art and the science of landscape architecture. And I think as we look at the projects today, and I challenge the students from UT to look critically at these projects, I just want to say a couple of things about the last 15 years here in the city. I don't think we can all sit here and give planning a bad name when we look at the plan that was done by Hargraves in '04 and why it needed an update. In fact, if you look at the '04 plan, we can check a lot of boxes and say, you know what, we did that. And you're going to cut a ribbon on one of those projects in a couple of weeks. So I would just say to all the landscape architects in the room, can you just raise your hands right now because I'm talking to you people. Okay? We're small in numbers. The planning profession came from us, and they number us 6 to 1. We shed 5,000 during the last recession. But the difference today between that 40-year period that had happened in the first half of the last century and then the period when we began to actually move into the light and show what landscape architecture can do, what is so exciting about the work today is that the projects that we witnessed, both large and small, were bottom up, they were top down, and the big difference today is that we're seeing landscape architects, not the concept of goals for a city that's run by a municipality or a bureaucracy, but in fact that landscape architects are leading the public engagement process, sometimes in an authentic way, which I applaud, sometimes in a sort of stale survey monkey version, but that's another lecture for another time. But I think the reality is that the landscape architects now are at the helm for both the public engagement, the design, and the stewardship. And I am really excited to come back and see what the next chapter holds for Dallas. I hadn't realized that therapy was in order because of the event that I guess you can talk about here, but you can't talk about anywhere else. It was interesting to hear that story again and again, and how if landscape architecture and parks and open spaces are the solution from something like that, sign me up. Thank you all, and thank you to our speakers.